Gulliver's Travels. Building background. Lilliput, a kingdom of 6-inch people, is the first place described in Jonathan Swift's satiric masterpiece, Gulliver's Travels. Originally titled Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World in 4 parts by Lemuel Gulliver, first a surgeon and then a captain of several ships. Gulliver's second voyage brings him to Brobdingnag, where he finds himself in the opposite position. He is the diminutive human among giants. Gulliver's Travels is not only a comedy about an ordinary man's adventures in such extraordinary places, but also a satire of English society in Swift's day and of mankind in general. While you are reading, think back to the satire activity and notes that you've already taken. Gulliver's Travels, Part 1: A Voyage to Lilliput. The first part of Gulliver's Travels describes Gulliver's adventures in Lilliput. After going to sea as a ship's doctor, Gulliver faces disaster as his ship breaks apart in a storm. He swims toward land, reaches shore, and falls exhausted on the ground. I lay down on the grass, which was very short and soft, where I slept sounder than ever I remember to have done in my life, and as I reckoned, above 9 hours, for when I awakened it was just daylight. I attempted to rise, but was not able to stir, for as I happened to lie on my back, I found my arms and legs were strongly fastened on each side to the ground, and my hair, which was long and thick, tied down in the same manner. I likewise felt several slender ligatures across my body from my armpits to my thighs. I could only look upwards. The sun began to grow hot, and the light offended my eyes. I heard a confused noise about me, but in the posture I sat, I could see nothing except the sky. In a little time, I felt something alive moving on my left leg, which, advancing gently forward over my breast, came almost up to my chin. When bending my eyes downward, as much as I could, I perceived it to be a human creature not 6 inches high, with a bow and arrow in his hands and a quiver at his back. In the meantime, I felt at least 40 more of the same kind, as I conjectured, following the first. I was in the utmost astonishment and roared so loud that they all ran back in a fright, and some of them, as I was afterwards told, were hurt from the falls they got from leaping from my side upon the ground. However, they soon returned, and one of them, who ventured so far as to get a full sight of my face, lifting up his hands and eyes by way of admiration, cried out in a shrill but distinct voice, "Hakana de Gull!" The others repeated the same words several times, but I then knew not what they meant. I lay all this while, as the reader may believe, in great uneasiness, at length struggling to get loose. I had the fortune to break the strings and wrench out the pegs that fastened my left arm to the ground, for, by lifting it to my face, I discovered the method they had taken to bind me, and at the same time, with a violent pull which gave me excessive pain, I at least loosened the strings that tied down my hair on the left side, so that I was just able to turn my head about 2 inches. But the creatures ran off a second time before I could seize them, whereupon there was a great shout in a very shrill accent, and after it ceased, I heard one of them cry aloud, "Toga phonic," when in an instant I felt above 100 arrows discharged on my left hand, which pricked me like many needles, and besides they shot another flight into the air, as we do bombs in Europe, whereof many, I suppose, fell on my body, though I felt them not, and some on my face, which I immediately covered with my left hand. When this shower of arrows was over, I fell a groaning with pain and grief, and then striving again to get loose, they discharged another volley larger than the first, and some of them attempted with spears to stick me in the side, but by good luck I had on me a buff jerkin, which they could not pierce. I thought it the most prudent method to lie still, and my design was to continue so till night, when, my left hand being already loose, I could easily free myself. And as for the inhabitants, I had reason to believe I might be a match for the greatest armies they could bring against me, if they were all the same size with him that I saw. but fortune disposed otherwise of me. When the people observed I was quiet, they discharged no more arrows. But by the noise increasing, I knew their numbers were greater, and above 4 yards from me, over against my right ear, I heard a knocking for above an hour, like people at work. When turning my head that way, as well as the pegs and strings would permit me, I saw a stage erected about a foot and a half from the ground, capable of holding 4 of the inhabitants, with 2 or 3 ladders to mount it, from whence one of them, who seemed to be a person of quality, made me a long speech, whereof I understood not one syllable. But I should have mentioned that before the principal person began his oration, he cried out 3 times, Langro de Hol San. These words and the former were afterwards repeated and explained to me. Whereupon immediately about 50 of the inhabitants came and cut the strings that fastened the left side of my head, which gave me the liberty of turning it to the right, and of observing the person and gesture of him who was to speak. He appeared to be of a middle age, and taller than any of the other 3 who attended him, whereof one was a page who held up his train, and seemed to be somewhat longer than my middle finger. The other 2 stood one on each side to support him. He acted every part of an orator, and I could observe many periods of threatenings, and others of promises, pity, and kindness. I answered in a few words, but in the most submissive manner, lifting up my left hand and both my eyes to the sun, as calling him for a witness, and being almost famished with hunger, having not eaten a morsel for some hours before I left the ship. I found the demands of nature so strong upon me that I could not forbear showing my impatience, perhaps against the strict rules of decency, by putting my finger frequently on my mouth to signify that I wanted food. The Hergo, for so they call it great lord, as I afterwards learned, understood me very well. He descended from the stage and commanded that several ladders should be applied to my sides, on which above 100 of the inhabitants mounted and walked towards my mouth, laden with baskets full of meat, which had been provided and sent thither by the king's orders upon the first intelligence he received of me. I observed that there was the flesh of several animals, but could not distinguish them by taste. There were shoulders, legs, and loins shaped like those of mutton, and very well dressed, but smaller than the wings of a lark. I eat them by 2 or 3 at a mouthful, and took 3 loaves at a time, about the bigness of musket bullets. They supplied me as fast as they could, showing 1,000 marks of wonder and astonishment at my bulk and appetite. I then made another signal that I wanted drink. They found by my eating that a small quantity would not suffice me, and being a most ingenious people, they slung up with great dexterity one of their largest hogsheads, then rolled it towards my hand, and beat out the top. I drank it off at a draught, which I might do well, for it hardly held half a pint, and tasted like a small wine of Burgundy, but much more delicious. They brought me a second hogshead, which I drank in the same manner, and made signs for more, but they had none to give. When I performed these wonders, they shouted for joy, and danced upon my breast, repeating several times as they did at first, Hakena de Gaul. They made me a sign that I should throw down the 2 hogsheads, but first warned the people below to stand out of the way, crying loud, Borak Mavola. And when they saw the vessels in the air, there was a universal shout of Hakena de Gaul. I confess I was often tempted, while they were passing back and forth across on my body, to seize 40 or 50 of the first that came in my reach and dash them against the ground. But the remembrance of what I had felt, which probably might not be the worst they could do, and the promise of the honor I had made them, for so I interpreted my submissive behavior, soon drove out those imaginations. Besides, I now considered myself as bound by the laws of hospitality to a people who had treated me with so much expense and magnificence. However, in my thoughts, I could not sufficiently wonder at the intrepidity of these diminutive mortals who dost venture to mount and walk on my body, while one of my hands was at liberty, without trembling at the very sight of so prodigious a creature as I must appear to be. After some time, when they observed that I had no more demands for meat, there appeared before me a person of high rank from his imperial majesty. His Excellency, having mounted on the small of my right leg, advanced forwards up to my face with about a dozen of his retinue. and producing his credentials under the signet royal, which he applied close to my eye, spoke about 10 minutes without any signs of anger, but with a kind of determinate resolution. After pointing forwards, which as I afterwards found, was towards the capital city, about a half a mile distance, whither it was agreed by his majesty and council that I must be conveyed. I answered in a few words, but to no purpose, and made a sign with my hand that was loose, putting it to the other, but over his excellency's head for fear of hurting him or his train, and then to my own head and body to signify that I desired my liberty. It appeared that he understood me well enough, for he shook his head by way of disapprobation, and held his hand in a posture to show that I must be carried as a prisoner. However, he made other signs to let me understand that I should have meat and drink enough, and very good treatment. Whereupon I once more thought of attempting to break my bonds, but again when I felt the smart of their arrows upon my face and hands, which were all in blisters, and many of the darts still sticking in them, observing likewise that the number of my enemies increased, I gave tokens to let them know that they might do with me as they pleased. Upon this the Hergo and his train withdrew, with much civility and cheerful consonances. Soon after I heard a gentle shout with a frequent repetition of the words Peplum Sellen, and I felt great numbers of people on my left side relaxing the cords to such a degree that I was able to turn on my right and to ease myself.